So my buddy Joe just called me and he was saying how I've said on a couple of videos that having control over something implies separateness from it. And he thought that there are some types of self-control that don't necessarily imply separateness. And I agree with that. I think that's what autopoiesis really is, the self-creating tendencies of the organism. The food that we eat becomes our structure, and our structure grows itself from the inside out and is constantly replacing and reorganizing and defining its own boundaries. So that's a type of self-control. But even so, the organism is not separate from the environment, and there's no mind inside the organism that's controlling it. The mind is a function of the total being of the organism. The brain works because of the body, not the other way around. The brain is an organ. And just like you would die without a heart, and you would die without a liver, and you would die without your kidneys, you would die without your brain, but it's one piece of the puzzle. A lot of sort of decadent science, modern science, the science of the Enlightenment, thought of man as a pair of eyes and a brain. And that's how Descartes and Bacon and Galileo conceptualized the world. And that's what the scientific method is based on, that type of conceptual thinking. Concept means with separation, with distance between my perspective and the world, so I can get an objective view of it. A decision means of separation. And all these words, all these thinking words, imply separation. We have this metaphor for the mind of a computing machine or a processor. The processors process discrete bundles of information. And that's where the symbol idea comes from, that computational cognitive science likes so much. I was just reading a book by Irwin Thompson. I posted a few videos about it already, and he described one neuroscientist's attempt to technologize the brain. In this chapter, Thompson is talking about how behaviorism and neurology is trying to transform human culture by sort of engineering human beings to be good and rational through behavioral training, through stimulus response conditioning. And the interesting thing is these neurologists are finding out that it's far more efficient to train people through pleasure than punishment, and they're learning how to stimulate the pleasure centers of humans to act as a reward function that causes us to increase our whatever the habitual pattern of behavior that they're trying to ingrain into us. Dr. Delgado, a neuroscientist's main purpose in his research is, of course, not to create salons of pleasure, but to discover cures for epileptic and brain-damaged persons who suffer from seizures of uncontrollable violence. In this he has been successful and is deserving of the modest fame he now enjoys. But like most human beings, Dr. Delgado is a contradictory creature. At one moment he is poo-pooing naive fantasies of a race of robots with radios implanted in their brains by the CIA, but at the next he is telling us how we can now move toward a psycho-civilized society by conquering the mind. One side of the profile of Dr. Delgado is the smiling, reassuring, deeply humanistic, and widely read family physician. The other side shows the Faustian gleam of the laboratory technician. This is a quote now from Delgado. The chronicle of human civilization is the story of a cooperative venture consistently marred by self-destruction, and every advance has been accompanied by increased efficiency of violent behavior. Ours is a tragically imbalanced industrial society which devotes most of its resources to the acquisition of destructive power and invests insignificant effort in the search which would provide the true weapons of self-defense. That is, knowledge of the mechanisms responsible for violent behavior itself. They are necessarily related with intracerebral processes of neuronal activity even if the triggering causality may arise in environmental circumstances. Violence is a product of cultural environment and is an extreme form of aggression, distinct from modes of self-expression required for survival and development under normal conditions. End of quote. Delgado takes issue with the behaviorists, for he is deeply concerned with the contribution of the organism to the stimulus response mechanism, and would define mind as the intracerebral elaboration of extracerebral information. But it is clear from the above that his disagreement with the behaviorists is only one of degree, because like B.F. Skinner, Delgado believes that violence is a product of the cultural environment. If one does not think in terms of the inherent values of the organism, then there is no convincing argument against manipulation. Technology can improve upon biology to eliminate the vestigial ape in man, and cultural design can eliminate the correspondingly primitive institution. If mind is bestowed upon the organism by culture, and science is the most important institution of that culture, then the physical control of the mind can be presented as not the destruction of a pre-existing entity, but the creative and scientific improvement of parenthood. In order to justify his science of the brain, it is absolutely essential that Delgado feel that his work is only the last act in man's conquest of nature. The raw organic premind is a jungle waiting to be cleared, developed, and civilized. What man has been able before to do to the environment is now about to be done with the brain. The mind, this is Delgado, the mind is not a static, inborn entity owned by the individual and self-sufficient, but the dynamic organization of sensory perceptions of the external world, correlated and reshaped through the internal anatomical and functional structure of the brain. Personality is not an intangible, immutable way of reacting, but a flexible process in continuous evolution, affected by its medium. It is quite possible that Delgado is correct when he says that human beings are born without minds, but one can draw two conclusions from this perception. One leads in the direction of genetic engineering and the physical control of the mind. The other leads in the direction of the no mind of Zen Buddhism. Of course, it depends upon what you mean by mind. Delgado feels that because there are no detectable signs of mental activity at birth, that humans have no minds until they are bestowed by their culture. It follows quite naturally that the more scientific is the culture, the more mind there is to be bestowed upon neonates. However, not all of Delgado's data support his conclusions. This is Delgado again. As the fetus grows, many organs perform something like a dress rehearsal before their functions are really required. This is usually referred to as the principle of anticipatory morphological maturation. The heart starts to beat when there is no blood to pump. The gastrointestinal tract shows peristaltic movements and begins to secrete juices in the absence of food. The eyelids open and close in the eternal darkness of the uterus. The arms and legs move, giving the mother the indescribable joy of feeling a new life inside herself. Even breathing movements appear several weeks before the birth, when there is no air to breathe. Why then should we not suppose that the brain thinks before the culture has given it any thoughts to think? There is, of course, an arbitrary aspect to this. It is much like defining a sound as a vibrating body, a medium, and a receiver. Without a receiver, there is no sound. Without a culture, there is no mind. But it is not all arbitrary. For if the organism develops before it encounters its environment, then it meets the environment on its own terms. Some efferent pathways appear before any afferent fiber enters the cerebrum. Initially, the cerebral association system develops toward the motor system, and the peripheral sensory fibers grow toward the receptor field. Significant conclusions from these facts are that the individual acts on its environment before it reacts to its environment. Total behavior is not made up of reflexes. Rather, the mechanism of the total pattern is an essential component of the performance of the part, i.e., the reflex, and behavior, therefore, cannot be fully explained in terms of stimulus-response. This means that the cerebral growth determines the attitude of the individual to its environment before the individual is able to receive any sensory impression of its environment. Hence, the initiative is within the organism.